just a Sunday after church. We had finally started, the pandemic happened, and we had finally just started back to church doing drive-in services, and restaurants had finally opened for outdoor seating. So we finally decided to venture out and go out to eat for the first time. And we met Gary, Joshua's dad, my husband's brother, for lunch. And he's like, "Hey, you want to go kayaking?" I'm like, "Is it not too cold?" He's like, "The water's chilly, but it's manageable, you know." And we're like, "Why not?" So we ate lunch, finished lunch, and he took our kids, and Gary and I decided we'd come home, grab the kayaks. But first we had to run to Walmart to get an extra paddle because we had just bought kayaks that winter, and one didn't have a paddle. And while we were there, they had a youth kayak, and we had talked about it for a while with the kids about Joshua getting one because he's very, very good in the water, very, very good kayaking. So I'm like, "Gary, you want to get it?" He's like, "Yeah, I think, maybe we should." And so let's surprise Joshua because he deserves it more than anything. He's always thinking about everybody else. We decided to go kayaking, and we surprised him with his very own kayak. He was so excited. I mean, if you see the couple pictures that was snapped, because we didn't have very much time from when we put in to when the accident happened, but if you see those couple of pictures, he's just cheesing, just smiling, and it's just, he was so happy, so excited that he had his own. And he was tethered to his dad's kayak so that his kayak couldn't get away, if it couldn't get separated. He had his life vest on, and when we went to buy them for our kids, we didn't get just, the run-of-the-mill cheap ones. We upgraded them thinking that we don't want them coming off of them in the water. So not only did they strap around their abdomen, but the straps came from their back up through their groin and snapped in the front. So that way, if the current was swift, it couldn't sweep it off their head, and then possibly risk drowning. Like we try to think of every situation in our head to put our children in the best case scenario that we could to keep them safe. As parents, I think every parent just tries to think of everything and that you can to keep your child safe. And so that's what we did. So we put in at a church member's river lot. That's what you do in West Virginia. You have river lots, and that's what you do in the summer to entertain yourselves. And so we put in there. We maybe went 10 minutes down the river floating. There was some guys fishing, so we moved to the left side of the river and waved. They waved back, and within minutes, we were at the spot where the accident happened. And there was 5 kayaks in total. The first one had my brother-in-law Ben and our daughter Abigail on it, and they were able to get to the right and get to around the place where the trees were down. The next 2 kayaks were Gary, my husband, and Joshua, and then my husband's aunt was in front of me, and I was pulling up the rear. Well, this was her first time kayaking. She couldn't swim very well, so she got stuck in a down tree, and it turned her kayak sideways. The water was so swift, I couldn't get out, but I knew I was going to hit her, and I knew that we would probably both flip when we did, and that's what happened. So in this moment, I'm going down the river, getting pushed backwards, looking for her, telling her, "Keep your head up, what to look for," getting banged off everything. There's blood running out of my ear because my head got slammed up against a tree. I'm getting her out of the water. We get together, get up on the left side of the bank. I see Benjamin and Abigail on the other side of the bank of the river, and the next thing I know, he's running back upstream and dives in screaming Joshua, and I look and there's no Joshua, and my heart sinks. And I look and there's no Joshua. There's no Joshua. I mean, the kid has a life vest on, right? You come up with a life vest on. He never appeared. And so what it was there was a tree that, I guess in a flood, had gotten pushed over. So the root system of that tree was up like a wall, and the water had just hit it for so long that it formed an undercurrent, and it just kept sucking down. In the time that he had hit it, the current against it was so hard that even adults had almost drowned there. Couldn't get yourself out of it. But his life vest, most adults, unfortunately, when they're kayaking, usually don't have a lot on, or a life vest on. It's usually in their kayak. And so they don't have something really to get stuck. His got stuck. His life vest got stuck under the water by the tree. My husband, who has MS, exhausted all efforts of trying to get him out. I went to jump back in. By this time, paramedics are there, because what we didn't know is the two guys we just moved over fishing from were paramedics. So within moments, they were there. And then it seems like within minutes from that, the ambulance crew was there, first responders were there, fire trucks were there. And so, to back up a little bit, the two guys were fishing. There was, when Ben threw Abigail off, there was people at a campsite right there, which should have already left. But I screamed across to them, watch my daughter. My biggest fear was she would try to get back in the water to try to get to her family across the river. And so they were like, we've got her, and call 911. They said it had already been done. In the meantime, the male of the group jumps in to try to help. By this point, my husband knew where to look. The only reason why, and it was another one of those, it was God thing, knew where to look, because when their kayaks went, they were tied together. Gary's went around the right side, Joshua's went around the left, but the current, to kind of tell you how strong the undercurrent was, my husband's a stocky dude. He's 220 pounds, all muscle, and he was in a set-in kayak. Joshua's was set on top. So as big as Gary is, with a set-in, it sucked it out, he said, like it was a feather, and sucked it under the water. Just swoop, and it was gone. So it had sunk and was down somewhere under, stuck in the tree too. And so Joshua's tied to it, set on top, was bobbing up and down like you have a fish on a bobber, on a line, a fishing line. So he's like, this is where I need to look first. And because of that, he felt an arm. So he began to pull. And the current was so strong that he would grab onto the down tree with a hand, and one hand, and he would pull and pull and pull with the other one. And because the tree had been in there for a while and old, the limb would snap and he would be swept off down the river. Get himself out. They would have to run about 15 yards upstream, but jump in, be tossed to it, grab onto the tree, try again. Having MS and his body weak, he couldn't go any longer. Michael, the guy at his campsite, came in, well, able-bodied, does physical labor every day for his job, couldn't get him free. Couldn't get him free. And he's screaming in the water, pray, just somebody pray, somebody just pray. He couldn't get him free. My brother-in-law, who's 6 foot, weighs more than his brother, don't even look like they're from the same family, just a big, strong guy, couldn't get him free. Couldn't get him free. What seemed like eternity, though, was in a span of about 7 minutes. My husband had about 5 minutes into it, had to give up because of his MS, because he had a decision to make. I'm so weak in my body. Do I continue on and die with my son, or do I live for my daughter and for my wife? So he had that decision to make. So he was on the bank. Then I saw him not being able to go no more, I went to jump in, but by this point, I'm thinking, I'm not as strong or as capable as these strong-bodied men. So then somebody's going to have to rescue me because I'm going to get in trouble, and that's going to take resources from trying to get my son. So I literally had one foot off the bank, stepped it back on, found my husband's waterproof bag that somehow just showed up on the bank, got his cell phone out of it, and just began to call people that I knew would pray. I began to call our pastor's wife, who is my mother, my spiritual mother, and say, you need to pray now. Call my aunt, you need to pray now. Call people from church, you need to pray now. Call my mother-in-law, you need to pray now. Because my resources were better allocated by getting people in touch with someone who could do the impossible than putting myself in a situation that would take physical resources from my son. So this is Ben's, I think, 5th time into the water, and he had the same decision to make because his body was physically tired from being, all of his strength holding on, trying to he got to the point where he would find a leg and climb it all the way up. His body had physically wore down. And at one point he had even got to the point where he had found his leg and climbed up it and got a hold of his straps, and he's praying, Lord, just let me get him unhooked. He's like, if I can just get his life vest, if I can get him out of his life vest that's stuck, then I can pull him free. And he would get, he couldn't get it done, and he would get swept down the river. So about his 5th time, I think it was, he was within 1 to 2 seconds from having to give up 2, saying he had to make the decision, do I die with my nephew or do I live with my niece? And by this time, being medically trained, he and I both knew this is 7-8 minutes without oxygen. You don't come back from that. Within 3 minutes of lack of oxygen, your brain cells begin to die. You don't come back from 8 minutes. That it's not. You just don't come back from that. Your heart's probably been not beating for at least a good 5 to 7 minutes, and so he was getting ready to have to make the decision to let go. And this kid who was pulled on by 3 able-bodied men fell into his arm. Just drifted. He didn't even have his hands on him at this point. Drifted against the current, free into his arms. And this huge hole that had been dug where they couldn't even stand up on because of the current and there was no footing, when he got into his arms, he stood up as free as could be with Joshua. And the 2 paramedics that were fishing had swam and gotten actually on top of the tree that was in the water up there. So he was able to stand, lift Joshua up to them. They laid him on the very tree in the middle of the river that had tried to take his life, and began CPR, life-saving measures on him there. They did a couple sets of compressions there. They jumped in with him, swam and got to the left side of the river, which was opposite of the road, over to this side of the river, got him up on the bank, started again. By this time, to say that he was purple is an understatement. I mean, in his body, as they carried him, would just be lifeless. His legs had no tone, his neck had no tone. He was just a rag doll. A purple, blue, looks like his whole body was bruised rag doll. And they would take turns. And by this time, someone else that wasn't supposed to be there felt God say, if you can get to give him breath from your lungs, I'll breathe through your lungs and he'll breathe again. So he swims across the river and said, I've got to do the rescue breaths. And he begins to give him rescue breaths. And at this point, to be honest with you, what I know from what medical training I have and what I know from God, my spirit man, my physical man, they were fighting against each other. I remember Benjamin coming up and saying, he's going to be okay. And I remember looking at him and going, Benjamin, you're not dumb. You know he's not. You know that this has been too long. And I remember him saying, but even if he don't, it's going to be okay. And I said, and that kind of like snapped something in me. Even if he doesn't come back, it's going to be okay. In that moment. But I remember looking at him, and as they ran him down to the next section, because they were trying to get him down the river far enough to get the rescue boat across, to get him across the river to the ambulance, to get him to the hospital. I remember at one point screaming, my son's not going to die today, in the name of Jesus, and falling over a down log and just kind of collapsing. I don't remember too much after that, but people at the scene tell me that I was just screaming out loud, in the name of Jesus, my son's not going to die today. In the name of Jesus, my son's not going to die today. He's going to live. And fast forward, so they get him across first to the ambulance. They come, bring the boat back across, the ambulance takes off, gets to our little tiny hospital who does not have the pediatric ventilator capabilities, and then they come back and get my husband and I. The wild thing too is that our local ambulance crew has 3 ambulances, and they're never ever all there at one time. They were all on our scene at one time. They were all there. And they put my husband in the second, and then my physical man and my spiritual man began to fight again. I wasn't in a rush to get to the hospital, which I worked at, because I knew medically, scientifically, I was going to claim a body. And I didn't want to do that. So I was okay with not getting there quickly. And so I went in the last one, in the last ambulance to go. And I remember getting wheeled in, and I had lost my glasses. I couldn't see anything because I hadn't had my contacts in, so I'd lost the pair of glasses that I had on. Couldn't really see what I was doing. Lost my flip-flops, I remember yelling to the triage nurse, which I thought was by her hearing and by like a fuzzy picture I could see, Susie, is that you? And when Gary, my husband, heard my voice, he screams, he has a pulse. So in the time it took for me to get from the river to the hospital, he had a pulse. And that was a story in itself, because the doctor comes into our counseling room to talk to my aunt, which is always the talk of, we've done all we can do, but we can't do anymore. And he was trying to figure out where the parents were. I need to talk to the parents. And he began to tell her, we're doing all we can. We're doing all we can. By this time, we're 40 minutes in full cardiac arrest. 40 minutes without oxygenation to the brain. It starts dying at 3 minutes. We're 40 minutes in, and he's telling her, we're doing all we can do, but right now we're not having any response. And she looked at him and said, but God. And when she did, they screamed from the trauma room, Dr. Stat, we have a pulse. The doctor isn't even in the room with them. And they scream, we have a pulse. When my aunt says the words, but God, and he turns to her and says, but God, and he runs down the hallway. So in that amount of time, to the time I get there, he comes in to examine me. I'm, of course, more interested. I don't care what's going on with me, and he knew that. But he did the right thing and examined me and told me the precautions of the concussion. I just wanted to know about him. So from the time of not having a pulse, being in full cardiac arrest for 40 minutes, not having any pupillary response, not being reactive to light, we have equal and reactive pupillary response by the time I get there. They're sluggish, but they're starting to respond. He's breathing, taking breaths on his own. He's bagged, of course, because he's full of water. I mean, one of the most wettest drowning. There's two different types of drownings. A dry, so you get knocked in the head, knocked out. Before you go in the water, you're not breathing, so you don't take the water in. Your lungs are dry. That's a dry drowning. Or a wet drowning, when you're fully, you're taking the water in. They said the stuff was just pouring out of them. I can say it. They got stuff out of them for days in the hospital, just wet as can be. But he was breathing, and they wanted me, I think, to know this, because when I got into the trauma room with him, they were turning him on his side and unbagging him so that the respiratory therapist could suction more secretions, more junk, more water out of his lungs. And when they took the bag off of him, which means they weren't giving him any assistance to breathing, the charge nurse, Robin, grabbed my hand and put it on his back, and I'll never forget the feeling of feeling it was my right hand on his little back and having him go and I felt 2 breaths before they rolled him back over and rebagged him to help him so it wasn't so hard up on him. And then they were going to fly him to Morgantown, to the trauma hospital that had a PICU, a pediatric ventilator capabilities. So the chopper was about 15 minutes out. So I knew that he would get there before we would, and we wouldn't be able to go in right away, but I would want someone there as soon as they could be with him. So my aunt left with me to leave for the hospital, and as we're leaving, we're told that the medevac can't get past the storm. There's a storm, and it can't even make it to the hospital. So here he can't even be flown to the other hospital because there's a storm between us and them. So the plan is to take him by ambulance again from our hospital to meet about 45 minutes away, the helicopter on the other side of the storm, and a window that they hope is still there in the storm to land to get him. And I can tell you that though our hospital may be small, and though it may not have a lot of resources that larger hospitals did, they had it together that day. And they took him, 2 of the nurses went with the ambulance crew and took him from Grant Memorial to Mount Storm, West Virginia, met the helicopter there, and the charge nurse called me that went with him and called me as she left him and said he squeezed my hand in the ambulance right up. And when we got there, he again squeezed it for the medevac crew. But, that's just the beginning, because then we have 6 days ahead of us of brain swelling that I don't wish upon anyone to have their child go through.